Hi, Jeff Spira here again, and today we're going to talk about Grand Bank stories. Now, Grand Bank stories were mostly derived here in the U.S. from the early settlers. Most of these were built in New England and the Canadian Maritimes. They started with the ships the boats that the sailing ships used to carry, and also by trading the Indians for some, of their canoes and various boats they used. But those ones that the ships used kind of looked like a Whitehall skiff. I don't know if you're familiar with those. They were round bottomed and wine glass transomed, and they were typically made by pretty good shipbuilders and boat builders in Europe. They're steam bent oak frames and that kind of thing. So anyway, they colonists traded with canoes, and they used bent frames and skin or bark coverings on them and that sort of thing. They were pretty crudely built at the time, and they were fine in protected waters and lakes, but they weren't really open water boats. So at that time, the French were also here, obviously in the eastern part of Canada, and that's why much of that area is French-speaking now. And they had what they called pirogues, and they were made of lumber, and typically they were 3-plank or 5-planks, twin chine on each side versions. Those were really called 5-plank dories, or 5-plank pirogues. The 5-plank boats were of more interest because they could be built wider, because it was hard to get a wide plank to build a boat, a 3-plank boat. So the 5-plank dories were more popular because you could get more beam out of them, and they'd be stabler in rough water. So the 3-plank dories look like the Cajun canoes that you see today. Remember, the Cajuns were originally the Arcadians, and they came from the eastern part of Canada, and they were hunters and fishermen and that sort of thing, and they ended up moving to Louisiana many years ago, because Louisiana was really a French sort of area. So it was originally owned by France, and then they sold it to the U.S. In the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, I think it was. But anyway, the Cajuns had a lot of these 3-planked boats that they would call pirogues now, or Cajun canoes, whatever, same sort of thing. So anyway, they still call them pirogues now. But for fishermen, they liked the 5-plank version. I actually have one now. It's actually it's a stitch and glue boat, so it's built of plywood panels, and it's a rowboat, and it carries a good load, and it's fairly wide and sturdy, and but during the American Revolution, from the mid 1700s, most of the standard boats were built like this one. It was a 5-plank sort of dory. So. And they transported people and cargo, that sort of thing, went fishing with them. Now, the big thing that happened that really sprung the development of dories was cod fishing. Cod fishing has been a major staple in Europe since the Middle Ages, and the people really scoured the seas for cod, where they could find cod. There was a big codfish trader in England called Richard Amarick, and there was actually some thought that might be where the word America comes from, because Amarick used to have a secret cod fishing spot that he would send his boats away, and this is before Columbus came. And they would come back loaded with cod, and they were thinking that, you know, that's where America kind of came from. Now the Italians say it was because of Amerigo Vespucci, but yeah, anyway, it's kind of an interesting story. But codfish was a big commodity, and after the settlers discovered the Grand Banks, which is right off the shore from the New England and eastern Canada, they started fishing it for codfish, and it's a bountiful area. Originally, they sailed out there in schooners that would go out for 2 or 3 months at a time, and they would just fish with hand lines off the decks of the schooners. But eventually, they found that if they could put the fishermen in a boat and send a bunch of fishermen out and scatter a wider area, they could catch more fish. So they went looking for suitable boats, and they ended up with a boat that had to be sturdy, and it had to handle rough weather. I mean, because it's blowy and windy out there in the North Atlantic, and so it had to handle big seas, and it was nice because they were stackable, because Dories, 3-plank style Dories were, you know, you could stack them. So that's the boat they kind of picked. So the dory production went way up, and it was mostly out of Lunenburg, Nova Scotia, where they built all these dories. They built sort of standardized dories in there in the early 1800s, and the cod fishermen would take them on the decks of the schooners and take them out to the Grand Banks. And while they were out there, they would use these fishermen in the dories, set them loose in the ocean there, and they would find their fishing holes and pull up fish all day, and then row back to the dory, and then they would prep the cod by salting it and drying it, and salt cod became a big commodity for the area. So you know, the builders in Lunenburg built standard sized dories, and they were measured by the length of the bottom. So they built 12-footers, 14-footers, 16 and 18 and 20-footers. But a 20-footer was really a 24 or 25-foot long boat, because they had overhang, you know, and the 12-footers were really closer to 15, and the 14s were 16, 17 feet, you know, overall, because of they measured just the bottom length, and unlike today where we measure the overall length. So these boats were just the ticket for the schooners, and they used these boats for almost 100 years. There were schooners going out in the 1900s, you know, the 1920s and 30s. They still took dories out and fished cod in the Grand Banks. And they stopped really at the time of World War II, because, you know, they were you know, the fishermen ended up in the merchant marines, and they were, you know, moving cargo to England, and there were, you know, German submarines out there and everything else. So they didn't really fish the Grand Banks dories or the Grand Banks for cod during the war, but afterwards they came up with other methods of doing it. Anyway, Winslow Homer, the famous American artist, has lots of great depictions of Grand Banks stories. You know, this one called "The Fog Warning" is one of his most famous, and you can see how far away these fishermen were from their schooners, and they would have to row back, you know, particularly if the fog was coming, so they could find the schooner again. And then another one called "The Helping Hand" is one that was famous to me. My grandmother had one on her wall when I was a kid, so she loved that painting, and I have always it always reminds me of Dories. Anyway, so some people ask, well, can you sail these dories? And the answer is yes, you can. This is a seine skiff dory that I'm going to show you a video of, and it's a Grand Bank style, and it's used to let out a seine net, which is used to catch fish. I've never seen one. I mean, in the Pacific, they don't use dory type skiffs for seiners. They use a big flat sort of almost always a metal skiff to put out seines for tuna and salmon. But I don't know what they seine in the East, but a lot of them still use these type of dories. So anyway, let's take a look at this video and tell me what you think. By the way, I don't think this boat has a centerboard. People have posted notes to me saying, you can't sail a boat upwind with no centerboard. What's wrong with you? Well, that's not true. First of all, you can't sail a round bottom boat upwind without a centerboard or a center keel. But a hard chine boat like one of these that's heeled over, which is it's going to do, you get a lot of area immersed in the water. So you get a lot of sideways sort of area. So yeah, it will sail upwind, and a lot of these seine boats don't really need centerboards to sail upwind. A centerboard will allow you to point higher, of course. It'll let you point, steeper than let's say 45 degrees or something. But one without a centerboard will track pretty well. So it's certainly a good way to go. Now, I offer the centerboard as an option in my 16-foot overall boats. And my 16, 19, and 24, I give you a design option for using a sailing skiff. It's a sprit sail rig, and the reason is because that was kind of the traditional ones that they used on the Banks dories. When the Grand Banks fishermen, were using them, they used a sprit sail, and when they sailed them off those things, because they were easy to take down and work pretty well. But here's a video of my 16-foot Banks dory called the Nova Scotian, and it's sailing along with the centerboard, but it actually has a aluminum mast and a Marconi Marconi rig, Anyway, so let's take a look at this. All right, let me tell you another story about a sailing in a Grand Bank story. There was a man named Alfred Johnson. He was born in 1846 in Denmark, and he moved to the U.S. and settled in Gloucester, Massachusetts. And he worked as a commercial fisherman. That was a pretty common thing for many of the seafaring folks then. That's when the cod schooners were sailing to the Grand Banks, and he fished with hook and line from the Dories. So he was out, and he also had a chance to sail the Dories because that's the rig they had available. So anyway, he was in a bar drinking in 1874 and playing cards with a friend, and they were discussing the possibility that a person could go back across the Atlantic from the U.S. back to Europe. So anyway, someone made him a bet that he couldn't sail back to Europe in less than 90 days. So they made a bet, and Johnson agreed to it. So then he bought a 20-foot dory. That's so it's more like 24-footer. It's kind of similar to my Labrador dory. And he made 3 watertight areas in it, so and put in bulkheads so it wouldn't sink. And he named the dory Centennial because remember this was 1875, and the U.S. was be celebrating its 100-year anniversary in 1876. But so on June 15th he took off across the Atlantic from Gloucester to Liverpool. And he made a brief stop in Nova Scotia where he made some adjustments and, headed out to sea after that and to make the crossing. And several ships spotted him on his way, and they tried to rescue him. And he said, no, I'm fine. He said he was okay. He was on his way, and one ship even passed him some bottles of rum. So, and he encountered some bad weather and had some really rough times surviving a gale. The boat capsized, and he got it back upright and bailed it out and everything. And so he averaged about 70 miles a day, which is, perfectly adequate for a solo crossing in a small boat. And on August 12th, he landed in Abercastle, Wales, where he rested for a couple days. And then on the 14th, 2 days later, he took off for Liverpool, and he landed there August 21st, 1876. I might have said 1875 earlier, but it was 1876. So the people in Liverpool, they were notified that he was coming, and they gave him a big reception when he arrived. He made the crossing in 68 days, so he beat the 90-day bet, and he ended up winning his however much it was. I don't know how much it was. So anyway, the picture that's shown up here now is actually a picture of Alfred Johnson, and that's the Centennial. That's the actual boat that he crossed the North Atlantic with. So, okay, well, let me tell you a bit more about my Banks style dories. I basically have 3 styles. The first one's a very narrow, very flat bottom design, and it doesn't have any rocker, so it's intended for moving fast and for power. It's not really a sailboat. So. Anyway, it comes in 2 sizes. I've got a 13-footer called the Juno, and here's one being rowed. You can see how it moves so well under oar power.
It rows very easily.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a larger size called the Texan, and it's 17 foot, and it rows or powers. A lot of people want to sail the Texan. They want to, I'd like to get the Texan and sail it. And I really have a 16-footer. That's a more traditional dory type arrangement. That would be a much better sailor, and it has more room than the 17-footer, believe it or not, because the 17-footer is narrow, so it doesn't displace as much as the 16-footer. So sailing boats take a very different shape than rowing or powering or doing it. So you could, I guess, sail one of these straight bottom boats, but you know, they're pretty tender, so static stability is weak. You know, I mean, it'll catch up and when it's tipped and be more, you know, reinforced and set you back up, but it's not really enough to run heeled like a sailboat should. So for more story use, where the boat's used for rowing and sailing and even some powering, my line of regular, you know, Grand Banks style dories would be a much better choice. They start small. They start with an 11-footer called the Otters Point. This one carries a great load and powers nice, and you know, with under oar for creeks and rivers and lakes and bays. You know, the people that have built them really like them. They use them for running out camping and you know, exploring the outer islands, and they're popular in the you know, the bays between the land and the outer banks and along the East Coast. So and this step up from there is the 16-footer, which is called the Nova Scotian, and this is easily my most popular dory. Been a lot of them built, a lot of really, really beautiful ones. I'm really impressed with the builders of them. Here's one under oar in Alaska. You can see it.
Daddy, say ee. Say ee, Daddy.
You know, you'd be amazed how much load these can handle, you know, because they've got a lot of flare. They're getting more and more stable as you load them down. So they're actually better under heavier load than they are lighter load. The step up from there is the 19-foot Alaskan, and it has a designed-in sort of motor well. You can build it or not build it. It's optional. Some people don't. Where you can drop an old a motor in there. Now, I had in mind when I originally designed it, it was back when there were only you know, 2-stroke engines, and so, you know, you could pick up a 2-stroke 7.5 horse motor, you know, short shaft with one hand and carry it and drop it in a hole and that sort of thing. Now, I don't know, you know, some of these 4-strokes, especially if you get up close to 10-horse 4-stroke, it's not nearly as hand maneuverable as they used to be. So they're a lot heftier these days. So anyway, I also have a 24-footer. It's called the Labrador, and it's probably more like the boat that Alfred Johnson took across the Atlantic. So my new design's a bit lower than the one you see in these pictures, and it's because I have redone this to all of them and have kind of lowered the center of gravity a bit so that they sail better, and so it you know, it would look it would look a little different than this, a little bit lower and a little bit broader. It's a waterline shape thing. So anyway, but that's a good be a great dory for sailing and for you know, headed offshore. This builder used his a lot for fishing out in the Northeast, so especially even in a blow. So they do pretty well that way. So Okay, well, that's kind of that line of dories. Now, I have a third style of dory, which is really the St. Pierre's. St. Pierre dories are really, in essence, Banks dories. And I've got three. They begin at 27 feet and go up to 36 feet. The one you see here is called the Beatrice, and it's not my design. It's a group up in the Seattle area that designed it. I just happen to think it's a beautiful boat. I haven't seen any of mine built. I've designed them specifically for people, asked me to do it, and I'm sure they have been built, but I haven't seen any yet. So I haven't seen any pictures yet. So. If you've built one, by all means, please send me a picture of it. So, I did have a couple of builders start with the big one, the 36-footer, called the Lone Star, because the guy lived in Texas, so I called it the Lone Star. And you know, I've got some construction photos of it, but he kind of disappeared, had some medical problems, and then he came back and was going to complete it, but I haven't seen any more pictures of it anyway. I always wanted one of these. I always wanted a 27-footer, and I'd put an 8-horse Buick engine in it, I think, you know, one of those diesels that they use in lifeboats. And it would be a great long-distance solo crosser. You know, you burn about 1/4 gallon an hour, so with, you know, and get about 7 knots out of it. So with, you know, 100 gallons of gas, you know, give you 400 hours. And that's 2,800 miles between fill-ups, something like that. Be a fun year or so in the Caribbean doing that, or, you know, somewhere across the North Atlantic via Iceland, you know, or maybe just a looper, you know, around the loop in the U.S. and up the East Coast and through the Canadian canals. That'd be fun. So, but there's plenty of those Buick diesels available, by the way, because they take them out of lifeboats that, you know, the shipbreakers, you know, they scrap those ships in India. They run them up on the beach. I don't know if you've seen the videos of them, but then they cut them up for the scrap metal and for the hardware and all that. And so plenty of those are available, you know, and none of those lifeboat engines ever run, you know. They run them to do maintenance, but that's it. They don't spend hours running them. So those are usually in really good condition when you find them. I see them for sale periodically. So in any event, that's my story about bank stories. So please like, share, and subscribe. And I'd like to thank you all for watching this, and take a look at a bank story if that's of interest to you. Thanks again.